news in New York City. This is Charlie Rose.
This year's annual United Nations General Assembly will begin Tuesday. This year's official theme is focusing on people striving for peace and a decent life for all on a sustainable planet. President Trump will address the international organization Tuesday morning in a speech that will likely focus on North Korea and Iran. Other key issues on the General Assembly's agenda include climate change, peacekeeping, refugees, and global health. Joining me now is Nicholas Burns of Harvard's Kennedy School and John Micklethwait, Bloomberg editor-in-chief. What should be the agenda for President Trump?
Well, I think, Charlie, President Trump has a tough road ahead this week because he arrives not in a very strong position. His administration's under investigation by a special counsel in Congress. He doesn't have the majority of the American people with him. Congress has begun to reassert itself against executive privilege. They voted for the Russia sanctions. They're out. They're going to vote for a strong State Department budget, so they're grabbing some power from President Trump. And he arrives where the big issues this week are the North Korea nuclear problem, the climate change issue, and, of course, the Iran nuclear deal. On two of the three of them, the president has imposed a bit of self-exile. He's taken positions that are at variance on Iran and on climate with every other major world leader.
But the important part is he has withdrawn from the Paris Accord. But now H.R. McMaster was on saying that, we're thinking about where we are on this, and they don't have to leave, and they don't leave for 2 years. And so they are sending a signal, that maybe they're willing to listen to other ideas on Paris. With respect to Iran, I'm hearing that, in fact, there are more and more stories, John, and you can speak to this, that they may not want to get out of the Iran deal.
The whole thing is very contradictory. I agree with Nick about the idea that he's having a rough time in Washington. It may conceivably be that in his mind he thinks he's coming to New York as almost a sort of light relief. He's come here for long. He's coming here for 4 days. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, nobody ever came here for that long.
He does have a home here.
He's coming to this place he previously derided as a club where people just go and talk, and actually putting some effort into it. I think on Iran, he seems to be in an awkward position whereby he seems to be saying some things to Israel, particularly about the idea that he probably seems like he may not want to, he may not allow the sanctions to stop the current version of the deal. That's one side of it. But the other side is that it is very difficult. The Europeans are probably unlikely to come with him if he turns against Iran. And the idea that the Europeans might lead the Russians and the Chinese seems possibly even further away. So he's in an awkward spot on this.
How is America's reputation around the world today?
Difficult.
You're a former diplomat.
I am. The Pew poll, which is a very highly regarded poll, says that our popularity and our credibility are dramatically reduced from the time that President Obama was in office, except in places like Israel, where, of course, the president's been very well regarded, President Trump, because of what he's been saying.
How about the Arab countries, too?
Some of the Arab countries, yeah, not all of the Arab world, but certainly the Gulf countries. Mm-hmm. The president has not really signaled to the rest of the world whether he's going to play the role that all of our presidents since Truman have played. Leader of the West, leader of the NATO alliance, protector and vindicator and supporter of the European Union. He spends a lot of time being publicly critical of alliance governments. You saw he accused 10 days ago, the South Korean government of appeasements, that he'd withdraw from the free trade agreement. This is not how the world is not accustomed to American leaders being tough on allies and embracing autocratic governments all the time. That juxtaposition, I think, has been jarring. And what he needs to do, and I hope we're going to see an adaptive administration now that General Kelly's there and Mattis, of course, is still powerful. He needs to adapt to that leadership style, to embrace our allies, to stand with Merkel, who we think she'll be returned next Sunday in the German elections, to fortify that NATO base, because to be successful on North Korea, to be successful in the fight against the Islamic State, to participate in the big negotiations over the future of Syria and Iraq with the Kurdish referendum coming, we have to have a strong base, and we don't have that right now.
It's interesting, actually, because what Nick says is absolutely right. He's shown no sign of being able to do this. But he is also a president, as we've discovered in Washington recently, who's suddenly capable, out of nowhere, turning around and saying hello to the Democrats. And there is that thing where if you don't seem to believe in very much, it has that advantage that you can swivel. The only thing is, the one thing which has been fairly consistent throughout this presidency is the idea of America first. And that is where it makes it terribly, terribly difficult with allies. And you can see already in the reception the Europeans are given. Nick is absolutely right. People are cross with Trump. They're not not willing to cut him a break at the moment. So he would have to do
America
something.
first, you wonder whether America will be there when you need them, don't you? Isn't that the point?
Well, I think that's the problem. When you go into Brussels in your first big trip to Europe, as President Trump did, and castigate the NATO allies and publicly cast doubt on whether or not we even want to be part of this alliance, this is a jarring departure from reality.
Angela Merkel said we have to act as if we're on our own.
She did, and of course, we've always wanted the Europeans to do more. And President Trump's right about one thing. He's right that the Europeans need to be more self-sufficient on defense. They need to spend more on their national defense, Germany in particular. So I think he's right to challenge them, but the way that he's done it has not been terribly productive, either with the West Europeans or with the South Koreans. I think he's done better, frankly, with Xi Jinping. They seem to have developed some kind of way to talk to each other on the phone now that they've met a couple of times. And we're going to need China, obviously, in the next round of the North Korea
in the Security Council, they were in favor of the sanctions vote most recently?
Yes, they've achieved something.
Did they not support the sanctions vote most recently?
They've supported one of them, but the previous ones, they were more dodgy.
No, but the most recent one is the one that seemed to indicate that they wanted to send some kind of signal to the North Koreans that...
But I think there's still a basic problem with the Europeans. They don't feel as if there is any pressure on them to help Trump out. And that's weirdly why Iran is interesting, is because this is a classic deal where if you did want to do something with Iran, you would perhaps escalate pressure on them. You would start talking about maybe changing pushing the deal off. The thing which really worries people is that the Obama deal is meant to end, depending on how you read it, sort of somewhere between 10, 12 years away. Maybe you could put it further away. But in order to get that degree of agreement about what to do about Iran, you sort of need the Europeans on side first. You need the British and the French at a minimum to sort of be sympathetic to that. And then maybe you begin to reach out to other people. And so this is where all the problems of the previous rhetoric come back to haunt you. It's not impossible, but it's extremely hard.
Macron of France, what will we be expecting of him?
Oh, I think there's a relationship where President Trump has invested. You know, he made this quick trip to France for Bastille Day, for July 14th.
And the French had to invite him, too.
They did.
So suggesting that they, too, wanted something.
Exactly right. And Macron is seen, he's important because he defeated Marine Le Pen and the French right wing, the populists, number one. Number two, the Germans need a strong French counterpart to solidify and strengthen the EU. The EU's had a bad couple of years. If Merkel's returned, if Macron can get his labor reforms, and that's currently at issue in Paris, passed by the French Parliament, that's going to help him both politically and also economically. And because France has military power, they're in Mali, they're very helpful to us in Syria, they're involved in the campaign against the Islamic State. I think the president admires that because he tends to judge countries on whether or not they're with you militarily rather than politically. And so Macron, I think, and Trump, they met today, are off to a good start, and we ought to want to see that relationship develop.
Does populism still have momentum?
Yes, I think it varies from time to place.
And Trump added to it when his victory added to the idea that populism was on the march.
Trump, as we can see, even now in the numbers, still has some bedrock of support of people who are just fed up with how it is, and they like it when he shakes his fist at it. And you can see that in Britain with what's happened with Boris Johnson over the past few days. You know, he is out there trying to rally the Conservative, what might be described as the main anti-EU Conservatives, by saying, look, you know, this Brexit thing has got to go through quickly. Don't mess around. Theresa May isn't doing enough. He would deny he was saying that, but that's very clearly the message he's been sending.
China. At Davos, we all saw Xi Jinping come and speak for a world in which a global point of view was appropriate. Does that suggest that China is prepared to exercise more influence in the world and has the appetite for exercising more influence in the world and wants to see the world turn to China in reflection of its increased power in the world?
It was highly ironic and a little bit hypocritical for Xi Jinping at Davos to say, I'm the guardian of globalization, right, when, of course, it's one of the most protectionist nations on earth.
Exactly.
But I think in a more serious vein in terms of what the Chinese want to do, they're not intent on global domination. They want a relationship with the United States. On big issues like climate change, I think Xi Jinping appreciated very much his joint venture with Barack Obama that produced the Paris Agreement of 2015. They know they need a good relationship with our government and our private sector to stabilize the global economy. So I think we're partners with China, but we're also competitors. And we're beginning to see that now in East Asia because the Chinese are pushing out into the South China Sea against 5 other countries into the East China Sea.
If there's one point they believe that they ought to dominate, it's that region.
Yes, I think that's the key point. I think there's a difference between China wanting to be a world power, which it quite likes it. It chanced its arm at Davos. It looked very good. You had this vacuum, and suddenly Xi Jinping appears in it. But on the whole, I think their priority is very clearly the region and what they can do there. And there are certain ways in which being a more global power helps them within that region. But the main priority for the Chinese leadership seems to be we want to get the reforms to work at home, and we need time to do that. I'm
interested in what you both might think about this. I was at a conference this weekend in which a very important American made this statement. The thing that we need to do is spend a lot more time focusing on our relationship with India. That is the crucial American relationship to pay attention to.
I think that person is absolutely right. Because here you have the world's largest democracy, soon to be the world's greatest population. They'll overtake China in a couple of years. Mm-hmm. It's a rule of law society, imperfect, but rule of law. India wants a strategic military partnership, not alliance, but a partnership with the United States and Japan. Mm-hmm. It doesn't want to fight China, but it understands that it needs weight, and Japan and the United States, especially the United States, can give it weight. India has more military exercises per year with the United States in the air and sea than anybody else. And this is a dramatic departure because for almost all of India's existence, its primary supporter has been Russia and the Soviet Union before it. Now it's the United States. And we have no bipartisanship in Washington except on India, where President Bush and President Obama and now President Trump, to his credit, have recognized this strategic opportunity for the United States and are exercising it. It's very important for us.
Yeah, it's also India is a country that's having some border disputes with China.
That's right, up in the Himalayas.
Right. A huge, long border, which they still dispute, and which the Indian politicians can be still savage towards journalists who draw the map in the wrong way. I think to some extent, if you look at that area through the eyes of Metternich or even Kissinger, you get a very straightforward sort of power game, great power game happening again. You have the world's most populous country at the moment up against the world's second most populous, about to be the most populous country, and you've got Japan on the other side. And you've got all the ingredients of great power politics pushing backwards and forwards. And with the Americans sitting outside, not sort of tending to back the Indians, but very, very nervous about what happens with China. And it's one of those long-term relationship management things which Talleyrand or Kissinger or Metternich would devote a huge amount of time and effort to. But one problem is the Indians themselves often take a very, very short-term approach, which the Chinese don't.
But is Modi different?
I think Modi is different from what India has had before, but he has a good side, which he's an economic reformer, and he has a bad side that he's very, very nationalistic. And the problem about that whole region in Asia is it is a cockpit of these nationalist emotions. It's not something where you can play things out easily. It's all about what is taught in textbooks in school, about not just about where lines or maps are, but what the Japanese and the Chinese did at different times of their history. It's a very nasty history which people keep on pushing forwards and backwards to each other. And if you change that, then I think that makes a big difference.
Beyond the obvious tension arising from North Korea's dramatic attempt to exercise, to show off its military might, and especially how far along it is in developing nuclear weapons that can sit on top of ICBMs, what are the other tension places that are under consideration this week? I mean, clearly another is Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. Explain that to me.
Well, I think right now you've got 4 or 5 areas that are under very close scrutiny by these leaders. You have North Korea, you have Iran, we've talked about that, the nuclear deal. You have the South and East China Sea crises.
And also the conflict with the Saudis, too, with the Arab states.
That's
between
right.
Iran, Shia, Sunni, as well as...
The big rivalry between the Shia and the Sunni in the Middle East, and we're seeing that play out in Yemen. We're seeing it play out in Syria and Iraq and in Lebanon. The Iranians are making a big push for power. And here, again, where President Trump has been right, is to say that there has to be a coalition formed, Israel, the moderate Arab states, the Sunni states, and the United States, to contain what the Iranians can do. The Iranians want, Charlie, to establish a physical, contiguous line of control, if you will, or arms supply between Tehran to Baghdad to Damascus. Of course, they've got troops on the ground in Syria, to Beirut. And they want to supply Hezbollah and Hamas with rocketry for the next rocket war against Israel. So the president, if he comes into the UN and he says, we've got a problem of an unconstrained Iran, he'll get some support on that from Europe and the Arab world. If he goes in to say, I'm truly going to question our involvement in the nuclear deal, he really will have no support.
But isn't that easy? The president could come in and say, look, you know, I'm going to support the nuclear deal, but I'm going to be a louder and more vibrant force against Iranian behavior in the world. I mean, you can do both, can't you?
A lot of people, you can do both, and you should do both. And I think that's where he'll get some support from Democrats in Congress on this. People like me who supported the nuclear deal will support him on the tougher line against Iran, the conventional part of the Iran problem.
It's a division between those two things. You have the deal, which was very explicitly just about the nuclear bit, and Donald Trump, perhaps correctly, is trying to broaden it to say, look, there are other unacceptable things the Iranians are doing, including trying to set up this route to the sea, but that, for the moment, is different, and it's hard for him to get that through, which comes back to that thing about he must be able to get allies to sort of trust him to go along to some extent, and that's where the difficulty is.
Is Rex, is the Secretary of State a different kind of Secretary of State because he hasn't had diplomatic experience per se, and because the State Department is not fully staffed? And therefore he is primarily relying on a coterie of aides that he's known before.
The problems he's encountering are not due to the fact that he's never been a diplomat. He was chairman of ExxonMobil, our biggest and most globally oriented country. He knew the world.
He's had more meetings with world leaders than most people.
Exactly right. The problem, I think, I'm a former diplomat, foreign service officer, is that he's not trusting the foreign service, the civil service. He's not investing in them. He doesn't appear to be connected to the leadership of our career diplomats, the people with real capacity and experience. He's proposing a 31% budget cut, which would decimate the State Department. And here's one of those areas where Republicans in Congress have come out to say, no way. We're not going to be party to weakening diplomacy at a time when Secretary Mattis is saying we need a stronger State Department. So morale's very low, and he's got to adapt and rebuild this department, but show confidence in the men and women who can help him. These are career people. They're not political. They'll work as hard for President Trump as they work for President Obama if you give them a chance, but that's not happening.
Well, because I would think that if you're a foreign leader and you look to the United States and you see conflict between a president and the national security apparatus, especially CIA, and what the relationship is, and then you look at state and you see conflict there, you wonder, how does America speak for itself? Now, the president will say, I speak for America, but diplomats know that there are many ways that you measure what a country stands for, beyond what the president says.
And one of the problems we've had on North Korea, for instance, is that the president has been all sound and fury and turmoil, and I'm going to get you. And Mattis and Tillerson have been saying, we're on a diplomatic path. We're not going to attack North Korea. We're not even, Mattis said, Secretary Mattis, we're not even trying to overthrow you, but we don't want you to have nuclear weapons, and we ought to deal with you, negotiate. It's a very different message. If you're Kim Jong-un, you're 34 years old, you've never been out of your part of the world, you don't really understand the Americans. The Americans are speaking with many different voices at the top of our government. That's a real problem in diplomacy.
It's interesting. You know, America has so much hard... Here I'm speaking as an outsider. America has so much hard power that you forget how useful its soft power has been at different times. Again, you go back to Kissinger, but you also go back to... Nick is a good example. Different times, America's managed to put pressure on countries like Russia. It's managed to put pressure on other areas of the world and done it not through the use of force. And what is happening, I think, under Tillerson, which people really seriously question, is whether that ability, which was always, it was good and to some extent camouflaged by all that hard power, whether that is still there. And there is one group of people who say, look, he is playing a very clever, long game, and ultimately, this will all come through. But with every kind of week and month, it gets, I think, harder for his defenders to come up. They need to come up with something that he's done.
Finally, there's the UN itself. This president criticized the UN. We have a new Secretary General. Can you make the case of the relevance of the United Nations?
You sure can. Look, the UN is not as efficient as we want it to be. It's a bloated bureaucracy. It can't resolve some of the big problems on its own. like the Syrian civil war in North Korea. But it's the only organization we have where 195 nation states come under one roof. It was our idea. It's in our most important city. We're the largest contributor to it. And I think the President, in his first meeting in New York at the UN, at the reform meeting, I think he surprised people. He didn't come with a big, tough message. He basically urged reform, but he didn't say he'd walk away. I thought that was positive.
I think it's interesting, here, out of all the things Trump, really went for, or dismissed as useless, the UN was one of them. But it is still, as, use the old Tennyson quote, it is the closest to a kind of parliament of man. And the basic fact is, if you want to meet a lot of world leaders, if you want to hang out with a lot of world leaders, which I think the President is quite enjoying, this is the place to come. And yes, you get a lot of bureaucracy. There is vast amounts of the UN that people, I think, would want to reform. But actually, at this precise moment, if you're Donald Trump trying to re-energise your presidency, trying to find something to do overseas that begins to give you a little bit more access, the UN is a useful thing. He may mess up, but we will see.
And it often should be said, and is said, beyond nation-state issues, we've got these tremendous problems that cross boundaries, whether it's climate. Refugees, exactly. And issues of slavery, human slavery, yes. And a lot of very, very difficult problems that this is the one forum there is, in a sense.
And the central organizer. It was the UN that put the climate change conference together in Paris in 2015. It's the UN that's leading on malaria, the drive to eradicate global health issues. So increasingly, these transnational issues that affect 7.6 billion people, you got to have some place you can go, and this is the place, right in our own country.
Thank you for coming, Nick. Great to see you,
Charlie.
John, last word to you.
I was going to say, it's hard, every single reformer where you look at the institutions of world government, and people say the UN is very, it's overweighty, it's got too many bureaucrats, it's got all these things, that when you try and redesign it, you nearly always come back to having some kind of body which is like the UN. It just makes sense for governments to have someone to come and talk. And as you say, there are all these transnational problems. And that means you're always going to need something like the UN, even if you try and change it.
Thank you. Great to see both of you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Stay with us. Ray Dalio is here. He is the founder, chairman, and co-chief investment officer of Bridgewater Associates. He created the firm in 1975 out of his two-bedroom apartment. Today, it is the largest hedge fund in the world with assets of around $160 billion under management. Fortune magazine has called Bridgewater the fifth most important private company in the U.S. The firm's success is anchored in its unconventional culture, which emphasizes values such as radical transparency and radical truth. Dalio expands on those ideas and more in Principles, Life and Work. I'm pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, so tell me the motivating reason to put this together for you. Why did you want to write this?
To help others make decisions better, to help them be more successful. I was originally very reluctant to share some of these principles. They were internal.
Because you thought they had led you to enormous achievement in the investment world, and perhaps personally as well, and therefore you didn't want your competition.
I don't like public attention. I would rather have privacy. But when we were successful in anticipating the financial crisis, we received a lot of attention. And because we operated with such different principles, had a unique culture, it became somewhat distorted. So I put those principles that we had at the time out in our website. And they were downloaded 3.5 million times, and I received a lot of thank you notes because it helped people a lot. And so I accumulated more, and now I'm at a stage in my life where I'm transitioning from what I'll call the second stage of my life to the third stage of my life. First stage of my life, or one's life, I think, is when one is dependent on others and learns. Second stage is when we're working and others are dependent on us. Third stage is when they all do well without me or without us. And so my objective is to try to help others be successful without me. So this is my year of transition from, I would say, from that stage, from the second stage to the third stage, and I want to put everything I had of value in that one book. And so it's a series of recipes, essentially, of when I encounter this or that, what I've used. I also hope that it'll encourage other people to write principles. Like I've been trying to get you to write your principles in each person, because I think if we can have principled level thinking. When something comes along, what do we do about that? How do you handle that reality? And we're clear on our principles. I think that would be important. I think it's particularly important at this time.
Okay, I want to talk about your principles. Let me just do a little bit of biography, though. Born in Queens. Mm-hmm. Your father was a jazz musician.
Yeah.
Mother?
Stay-at-home mom.
Stay-at-home mom. Went to LIU, mm-hmm. right? Long Island University.
That's right.
Then went on to Harvard Business School. Was a caddy and had made a little bit of money and invested successfully on a small scale. But it gave you some great desire
I got hooked on playing the game.
That's right. And the game was what, as you would describe?
The markets.
The markets.
Okay, yeah.
And
when I was 12, I was caddying, and the stock market was hot. And I took my little caddying money, and I figured I'd buy stocks. And the first company I bought was the only company I ever heard of that was selling for less than $5 a share, and I figured I could buy more shares, and if it went up, I'd make more money.
Right.
That was a dumb strategy, right? Yeah. But what happened is this company was about to go bankrupt, and somebody acquired it, and it tripled. And I got hooked on the markets. And that began to be something that was a game, and it changed my way of thinking completely. It changed my way of thinking because in order to be successful in the markets, you have to have an independent view that's different from the consensus, because the consensus is built into the price. So you have to have an independent view different from the consensus. And you're going to be wrong a lot. And that began to influence my way of thinking.
You were wrong in, what was it, 1982, thereabouts?
Yeah, super wrong.
You bet that the market was going to go down.
Yeah.
And the market started on a bull run.
One of the greatest ever.
So you bet against that great... And went broke?
And went broke, yeah. I anticipated, calculated that countries could not pay their debts back to American banks. And that happened. In August of 1982, Mexico defaulted, and a number of countries defaulted. And I thought that was going to cause an economic disaster. And that was the exact bottom in the stock market. And I got a lot of attention. I was on Wall Street Week and all of that, and I couldn't have been more wrong. And I had to let everybody go. These are people I had wonderful relationships. They were like my extended family. And I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to help pay my family bills. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the most painful mistakes that ever happened to me in my life. And it turned out to be one of the greatest things that happened in my life. And that was because I went from thinking, that I knew, to asking myself, how do I know I'm right? How do I know that point of view? It gave me the humility that I needed to balance with my audacity. And it really led to this idea meritocratic way of operating.
So you wanted to say to everybody who's working with you, because of the lesson of 82 is that let's test every idea we have. Let's make sure that we're right, and let's listen to some tough critics of our idea and let it prove its worth.
Well, it started with me.
In the world of challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have anybody at that time, and it started with me thinking, what could I do to be better? And in particular, I wanted to speak to the smartest people I could who disagreed with me, right, to try to find out what their perspective was. I wanted to know how to balance my risk, and I also wanted to take a look at history in a different way. But the most important thing that it gave me was that need to be among independent thinkers who disagree, and to get the most out of that disagreement to develop an idea meritocratic way. So to develop an idea meritocracy, by that I mean where the best ideas win out, that they're not just mine. Because I think one of the greatest tragedies of mankind, of each human, is holding on to opinions that are wrong, being so attached to them, and not putting them out there and stress testing them. So by putting them out there and stress testing them, it was essential. So there are three things that we have to do in order to have an effective idea meritocracy, and this has been the key to our success. First, everybody's got to put their honest thoughts on their table, speak frankly. That's not easy. Most people won't do that, but that's what we do. Second, you have to be use the art of thoughtful disagreement. Enjoy disagreement. Doesn't mean it's conflict. It's an exploration of different points of view so that better ideas can come than those that are just in one's head. And then the third thing you have to do is have a way of getting around disagreements if you still have remaining disagreements, how you get past those disagreements and move on and find that acceptable. And so we have what we call believability-weighted decision-making. In other words, in most decision-making, there's either the boss who makes a decision in a hierarchical way, or you have a democracy in which everyone has equal votes. Both of those are not the best. In other words, the boss making the decision, how do you know the boss is right? And then the equal votes, that's silly because not everybody's equally good. By being able to weigh each person's point of view based on their own
So you
abilities,
weigh it based on past performance?
Past performance, assessments of each other, tests, yeah. And so there are points. Literally, somebody has a certain amount of believability points on different expertise. It may be, is it an economic question? Is it a legal question? Is it requiring different attributes? Somebody might be a big picture thinker, but be lousy at details. Or somebody might be really perfect at details and, the opposite. And so when we think about that, our goal is idea meritocratic thinking. Because if you can make great collective decision making, and you can then write those decision-making criteria down in principles, and then we've converted those to algorithms that make computer decisions in parallel, that's been our formula for success.
So it's the formula, that's the formula, not you, not one individual, but the process.
That's right.
Is what has prevailed.
That's
the
right.
process.
That's right.
A bit more about the company, because when some people have come to you and you talk about this and basically said, you're a jerk and you don't know how much you're offending people and hurting people by your conduct.
Yeah, there was a time in, I think it was 1993, people, I'm working with a small group, and they told me that, which is great. And then, and I said, I don't want to hurt people's feelings. I don't want to do that. But I want to speak frankly, and I want them to speak equally frankly with me. So I was in a dilemma. Could I be 100% straightforward with them, and was that going to work? Or would they not want me to do that? So that dilemma made me think, how am I going to deal with that situation? And then I realized that I should have conversations with them and ask, how do you want me to be with you? Do you want me to tell you what I think and hear from you what you're thinking? And can we work that through? Or should I keep that to myself? And should we have a culture in which those things are held behind the scenes, and which would mean a political culture, that kind of thing. And so that began a process in which we said we would write down how we should be with each other. So these these principles became to how to develop an idea meritocratic process through that radical transparency. Let me be clear. This is not for everybody. This is not for everybody. People encounter that one way or another, that some people wouldn't want it any other way, that radical straightforwardness, and some people love it. So we go through that process, and that was an example. And I think that's such a good example that I wouldn't have known that if people didn't speak up like that. And there's so many things in my life that I probably just would have been clueless to.
I'm going to come back to more of your life, but let me ask you this. In 1982, in 2007 and 8, when everybody else was losing money, you made money. You made it big time, and it gave you a huge reputation in the financial world, global financial world. Was it the process that you believe enabled you to make the right decisions and the right calls?
Yes.
Because whatever idea you had, you wanted it tested in every possible way.
Yes.
Without concern for feelings or emotions, just the meritocracy of the idea, the investment idea that was controlling where you placed your funds.
Because it was a kind of a crazy view. Yeah. Meaning it was, when I say crazy, what I mean is it was a view that nobody had. It was a bubble. And rather than a bubble, it looked like enormous prosperity, and I'm talking about a bust. And how do I know I'm right? I'm still not sure I'm right. And how do we have that independent thinking so that we could step aside from the crowd and make a bet that's opposite the crowd and know how to manage that successfully. So I need independent thinkers who are going to stress test each other.
Now, are they all within your firm, or are they way beyond your firm?
I'll go wherever the greatest, smartest disagreement is.
All right. Then there's the case of Greg Jensen. Mm-hmm. All right. Here you were at 60, late 60s, and you make a decision about a person who you'd work closely with is the right person for this next job.
Yep.
Correct?
Yep.
You made a mistake.
Yep.
So how did you use this perfect process and come to the wrong conclusion?
Well, that's the process, right? In other words, I think I explained how failure is such an important part of the process, of a learning process, right? I don't know what the right decision is. And the ability to, frankly, I think almost in any case that I haven't done something before, I think there's a high probability I'm not going to do it right. So when we started out, we said that this could be up to a 10-year plan because I knew that I didn't know necessarily how to do that. And so we undertook that process, and we learned about different things, learned about mistakes that I made in terms of making the choice and putting so much on one person under those circumstances. In this particular case, it was a situation that because the business had grown up under me, I was both an investor and running a business. And I gave something that was too big,
both management and investing.
Both management and investing.
Right.
And I gave something that's too big, even was getting too big for me with experience. I gave that to Greg, and then we went through that. And what we saw was, of course, there was disagreements as to what should be done and how to do it. And one of the great things that we saw is that because we had this idea meritocratic system that we believed in, that we could work ourselves through that, even though we might have those differences. If you don't have a system for getting past your disagreements, you're going to have trouble. Think about it like the presidential election. We have somebody who wins the popular election. Another person wins the electoral college, okay? If we didn't have rules that we respected about how to get past our disagreements, we'd have a civil war. But because there are procedures...
That's why when people talk about not respecting the rule of law, if you don't have rules and I'm not going to accept this result, then you have a real problem and a real breakdown.
That's right. And so
that's why rule of law is so important.
That's why rule of law is so important. And those rules, though, have to be perceived as being fair. In other words, everybody says that's fair. And so when we went
you have to believe in what fact is and what truth is.
Well, but also knowing you may not know truth.
Right.
You may not know what's true.
Facts.
Okay. You try to find your facts, but different people even perceive the facts. The key is how do you work yourself through disagreement well by you believe the process is fair. And so this idea meritocratic process allowed us to get through it. In most companies, if you look at most companies under the same circumstances, they wouldn't have got through their argument because the individuals involved would probably have said, oh, that jerk and whatever, and they would have had it. But if you believe that even though you think it's right, that everyone around you thinks that that's wrong and you take a vote, you can get past the disagreements. That's a very big power of an idea meritocratic process.
But in this case, it was your decision and your decision alone.
No.
So there was a committee that decided?
That's right.
There was a committee that said, that's right. We've heard almost like a jury, guilty or not guilty?
Literally like a jury, okay? There were cases, there was a group of about 15 people, senior people. That's how it works. There was a group of about 15 senior people, senior management people, and a group that's we call Stakeholders Committee, which was like a board. And we all are a community together. And so we all got together, and we heard the different positions, and then we went through that, and we took a vote, and we decided what should be done, and everybody thought it was fair.
So what was the end result?
That we would make a transition at the time to Greg working as a chief investment officer. He's a brilliant, fantastic chief investment officer, part of that process. And that the management responsibilities for a year would come back to me, and that we made that transition. Then I did that for a year. And then we went on to have David McCormick and Eileen Murray be co-CEOs.
Right.
Me step back into a chairman role. And then, of course, I'm doing the investment I'll always do the investment part as
You'll
part
always
of that
do the
team.
investment part.
Well, it's my game. I love to play the game. I will, for the rest of my life, play the game. Now, in terms of making others people successful, I never want to be dependent on. In other words, I want to make the other people around me successful. So I'll do the game, but in a way where I'm making their success of paramount importance. In other words, to teach the man how to fish.
When people say this sounds like a cult, does it offend you?
It does. It's just a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
It's just a misunderstanding. It's
Because
often a misunderstanding.
You've got cameras and microphones that are taking what everybody says, and so everything's on the record, and therefore there's no there's no avoiding what you have said because somewhere somebody has recorded it or taken a picture of it.
So just so everybody understands, that's so everybody can see everything, right?
So you speak from the same page.
You can't have an idea meritocracy. If I don't let you to see something, then you can't have an opinion on it. Those who control information are the people who are going to be in control. So in order to have an idea meritocracy, well, this isn't for spying on people or anything like this.
No.
This is for the notion that anybody could see it firsthand and then make opinions of it and judge it. If you don't, so let me, in one sentence, describe what this is about. It's to have an idea meritocracy in which the goals are equally to have meaningful work and meaningful relationships, to be excellent at work and excellent relationships, and to do that through radical truthfulness, can talk about anything, and radical transparency so you can see everything. That's the basis of our idea of meritocracy, and it's worked.
And you also think that this is what could be applied to almost all the big questions of our time. If we use this kind of rigorous process, we would come to a much better understanding of all the complex issues, whether it's climate change or whatever it might be.
Of course, if we're stuck with
fighting terrorism or
whatever the issue is,
making decisions about investment.
The process is equally valid, right? In other words, let's put our thoughts on the table. Three things. Put our thoughts on the table. Know the art of thoughtful disagreement so that we can pull that together and get past those disagreements in an idea meritocratic way. Yes. And I think you can't have good relationships. It's a personal relationship thing, too. In other words, how are you going to work with each other? Can I be truthful?
Would this apply to marriages as well?
It applies to any relationship that you better establish what your principles are and how you're going to deal with each other. You don't have to follow an idea meritocratic way, but I believe in myself. There are two things I require from people in any relationship I have, and that is to be reasonable and to be considerate. And I will be very reasonable and I will be very considerate. And so I know that we'll have to have that thoughtful disagreement and ways of getting past that thoughtful disagreement, regardless of our relationships, in a marriage, in any relationship that I have. That's a personal belief. And that's what served me well. I've been married happily for 40 years, and that's worked out.
Also, what has served you well is your curiosity. This whole sense of wanting to know things, wanting to learn as much as you can. And along the way, you have, and you have talked about this, you have had and shared the friendship of some extraordinary people. There's a man on the standing committee in China named Wang Qishan. He's been in charge of corruption. He's known to sort of the top level of Americans as one of the most influential people in China. He's one of the people that you admire the most because you think his mind is in total pursuit of understanding how everything is connected, a kind of theory of everything. Tell me more.
I admire him. I admire Lee Kuan Yew, as you know. I admire Paul Volcker. I admire many people because of the ability to go above things and to look down at the world as a reality machine and to just think, how does that reality machine work? And to recognize that everything happens over and over again. The same things happen over and over again. Everything.
History has patterns.
Yes. Everything is another one of those. And so when you start to think about how does reality work and what are the principles for dealing with reality, and that implies to everything. We could talk about principles for skiing, principles for parenting, and so on. And so he thinks of human nature. I mean, it's basically almost that there are a limited number of personality types. Maybe there's 20 personality types. I couldn't tell you the number. And there's a limited number of situations. And these things keep happening over and over again. And when you start to see the patterns or look for the patterns, it's almost like you can see the universal theory of reality. And he's striving to do that, and he looks at the world that way. It's intelligent. It's not emotionally carried away. He appreciates the beauty of reality, even though the harsh realities. So I admire him for that.
But I assume you're in constant pursuit of sort of a greater understanding, too, because the principles are continuum. And I just open it to one thing. Bad, worry about appearing good. Good, worry about achieving the goal. Bad, make your decisions on the basis of first-order consequences. Good, make your decisions on the basis of first, second, and third-order consequences. So this book is full of that, but you're constantly adding to principles. You started with 10, now you have 200.
Well, what happens is, as I learn something, I've gotten into the habit of taking the time and writing down what is my principle for dealing with that thing. And I'm constantly learning. By the way, it's the best habit. I recommend it for everybody. Whenever something's happening and you're making a decision, write down your criteria for making a decision. And when you do that, you can also communicate it to others, and you can refine it over time. And what's been magical for us is also we found that we can convert that into algorithms so that we can also have computers run in parallel making those decisions with us. This is happening. This is the type of thing that is a key to success, to be able to think, what are my rules, so that when another one of those comes along, I handle it well.
Are you saying that you're teaching machines how to make the kind of investment decisions that only human beings have been making at Bridgewater?
Oh, we've been doing this for 25 years.
But you also have a huge investment in artificial intelligence.
Yes. Well, yes, in algorithmic decision making, right? That's right, because it's a language. An algorithm is just like writing, but it specifies those criteria. If you think of the brain, as you know, the brain is 89 billion neurons. And so those are little computers.
It is an interesting slip of tongue from neurons to euros.
People in my business might do that. But they're little computers.
Right.
And they are programmed literally that way. And then data comes in. And that's how we make decisions. And nowadays, we can take our criteria and we can specify those, and we can have computers make decisions in parallel with us. It's like using a GPS. That's what it's like.
So where does intuition, instinct, hunch play in all this?
Oh, it's critical. And it's also, by the way, what the computer can't do well. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's the subconscious. As you know, man, although it's only 200,000 years old, the brain is much older. And we came programmed with many of these things in our brain, intuition and those things. And they're in our subconscious. And so by opening up one's subconscious to one's consciousness, so they come up, creativity comes from not working hard at it. It comes from relaxation. It bubbles up from the subconscious.
That's why you believe in transcendental meditation.
Transcendental meditation has been invaluable to me because it helps to do that. But that intuition, that creativity, man is still unique at being able to do those things. So you let that bubble up, but you have to reconcile it with your logic. So when the subconscious creativity, intuition comes up and you replicate it with your logic, it's fabulous. But then you take what you learn and you just you do something with it. Our converting it into algorithms and realizing that has been invaluable because the computer can process a whole lot more information, a lot quicker, and a lot less emotionally, so it contributes. But you don't have to do that to have an idea meritocracy. I want to be clear. Anybody in any relationship can have an idea meritocracy.
Where is the global economy headed?
I want to put it in perspective to give everybody a framework. I did a 30-minute video that I know you saw on how the economic machine works.
The economic machine,
right? So there are, if I can make this clear, I think anybody can understand that. There are three main forces. There's productivity, In other words, we learn, we invent, our living standards rise. And then there are two big cycles around that. There's the short-term debt cycle, which we call the business cycle. You know, that lasts for about 10 years, maybe.
8 to 10 years.
And then there's a long-term cycle, a long-term debt cycle, which this accumulates and you build up a lot of obligations for the future, and that's a burden on the future. Right now, productivity is rising, although it's much difficult to measure, but I won't get into that too much. We're in the part of the cycle which is that when the economy is not too hot and not too cold, and when inflation isn't too high and not too low. It's the worldwide, generally speaking. We're in that part of the cycle. It's a good part of the cycle, okay? But we have an enormous number of liabilities. They're not just in the form of debts, although there are a lot of debts. They're also in the form of pension obligations.
Aren't they debts? I mean,
they're a type of debt.
Right.
They're an obligation.
Right.
And then there's also the health care obligations. And we have a demographic that's changing. And so that's changing. And then as a backdrop, we have really two different economies, okay? There's the economy, which I'll call for the bottom 60%. And then there's the top 40%. Or you can make it the top 20% and the bottom 80%. Two different economies, two different worlds. That disparity in wealth and circumstances is the greatest since the 1935 to 40 period. The top 1/10...
Which you think is the most interesting comparable period.
Which I think is the most interesting comparable period.
Correct?
Yes, that's right. The top 1/10% of the population has a net worth that is equal to the bottom 90% combined. If you look at the economy of the bottom 60%, just say, what does that economy look like? It's a miserable economy. It's a miserable set of circumstances. There's not been growth. Death rates are rising. Suicides, opiates, and so on. It is a miserable economy. And so we're in a period that is analogous to that period where there's a gap. So when we talk about the economy, we should really start to think about the two economies and that we need to deal with that other economy. There's technology that is wonderful, but it is at the same time replacing people. And so when we deal with algorithmic decision making and we deal with that process, you can expect that that's going to increase the wealth gap, and it's going to increase that. And so the biggest economic, social, and political issue of our time is that split and how to deal with it.
Can our society survive if it doesn't do something about that split?
I believe that's right.
That is the question.
That's the question.
The book is called Principles by Ray Dalio. Bill Gates knows something about these ideas. Ray Dalio has provided me with invaluable guidance and insight that are now available to you in Principles, which is in fact the point here. The point here is Ray Dalio wants you to understand what he has discovered in life and share it with you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time. For more about this program and early episodes, visit us online at pbs.org and charlierose.com.
Thank you.